Hello again. We are going to take a vote. The vote is going to be, would you like me to speak as slowly as I did in my first talk or more quickly? The Americans do not get to vote. No Americans, regardless of your genetics, only Vietnamese vote. How many people would vote for me to speak very slowly again? Okay, I'm speaking slowly again. Here we go. This presentation is based on the idea from Dr. Dung that it is appropriate now to include inherited predisposition to breast and ovarian cancer in our genetic testing. In this context, we are testing adults. Generally, we are testing women who have already developed breast or ovarian cancer. And as we will see, it is important for them to know if they had a mutation in BRCA1 or BRCA2 or one of the other genes, because there are special precision treatments available if that is the case, and because we can determine whether their younger sisters and daughters carry the same mutation and therefore might wish to undertake prophylactic oophorectomy after they have their children. But I am getting ahead of the story. I will begin by showing you several families, very large families, that I have known for a very long time, because it was in these families that BRCA1 and BRCA2 were first mapped by linkage analysis. Those of you who are young probably have never done linkage analysis. It's lots of fun, but sequencing is even more fun. Let me show you what is important about mutations in BRCA1 using this family as an example. As you see, this mutation in BRCA1 is a 2 base pair deletion in the middle of the gene, which of course causes a frame shift and an immediate stop. This family is American, English ancestry. They live in the American Midwest. As you see, this mutation called V has been inherited throughout this family for many generations and is present in women with very young onset breast cancer. The breast cancer in this family is exceptionally young. I chose it for that reason, to give you an example of an extreme situation. Notice also that some of the women with the mutation have developed ovarian cancer in addition to or instead of breast cancer. Notice also, very importantly, that the mutation can be inherited from the mother or from the father. Men have genes too. They are responsible for inheritance in half of the cases. Even now, more than 20 years after the identification of BRCA1 and BRCA2, the greatest challenge is still to remind our physician colleagues that they must ask about the family history on both the mother's family and the father's family, aunts, grandmothers, cousins, and so on. Notice also in this family that we see cases of pancreatic cancer, which we now recognize as part of the syndrome involving breast and ovarian cancer and BRCA1. We also see colon cancer, but it is not part of the syndrome. It's a common cancer, and it occurred in this family by chance. This family illustrates the basic principle of inherited predisposition to breast and ovarian cancer due to mutations in BRCA1 or one of its sister genes. In particular, for families with inherited mutations in tumor suppressor genes, like this one, cancer is initiated by one inherited mutation plus one somatic mutation, where the somatic mutation is tissue specific. BRCA1, BRCA2, and their sister genes are responsible for inherited very high risks of breast cancer. I show you this pedigree to illustrate how critical the C terminus of BRCA1 is. This mutation leads to loss of only 11 amino acids, but that's enough to cause this devastating effect. This family proved very valuable to biochemists who were working to understand the function of BRCA1 and BRCA2 under normal circumstances. When these genes were cloned, none of us had any idea what their normal function was. It's not like P53, it's not like HNPCC. These genes were identified purely by genetic approaches, and no one knew when they were first cloned what they would do. As we will see, they turn out to do something very, very important. But first, let me show you this family. I want to show you this family because, this family illustrates a point that I thought was true 25 years ago, and I had a terrible time convincing people, but now it is proven and clearly true. And that is that mutations in BRCA2, especially, in men, lead to higher risks of prostate cancer. The reason this was so difficult for people to accept is that there's two reasons. First, the increase in risk in prostate cancer among men with BRCA2 mutations is significant, but not nearly as bad as the increase in risk in breast and ovarian cancer for women. The second is that these mutations lead to very aggressive metastatic prostate cancer. Much of prostate cancer is much less aggressive. And that less aggressive prostate cancer is not significantly associated with BRCA2 mutations. This kind of prostate cancer, BRCA2 prostate cancer, is, I think, similar to triple negative breast cancer in women. That is, it's aggressive, it needs to be treated aggressively, and therefore, for men who are carriers of these BRCA2 mutations, very good scrutiny is important. It is now clear, thanks to very fine biochemistry by many people, that BRCA1, BRCA2, and the sister genes are critical to repair by homologous recombination of double-strand DNA breaks. Obviously, this is a very fundamental biological process. These genes are quite young. They are invertebrates, but they are not in yeast. the way that P53 is in yeast, or the way that that the mismatch repair genes are very similar in yeast and in mammals. These are young genes, and this form of DNA repair is largely vertebrate specific. The prokaryotic homologue of this system is the REC-A system. Those of you who work in microbiology will recognize REC-A. Who would have thought that REC-A was revisited as BRCA1 and BRCA2? This process, this recombination repair process, is very complex, and BRCA1 and BRCA2 and their partner genes, which make a large complex, play roles, as you see, in multiple different steps. This is still being worked out by molecular biologists. I want to show you this family because they are a particularly interesting and exceptional example of missense mutations in BRCA1. Almost all the mutations in BRCA1 and BRCA2 lead to stops. They are either frame shift or nonsense or large deletions. But a few, maybe 1%, 2% of mutations are missenses. And this is a particularly devastating example. This missense mutation destroys the capacity of this beautiful heterodimer, the BRCA1 BARD1 heterodimer. It destroys its capacity to bind zinc. And this BRCA1 BARD1 heterodimer is now recognized as functioning as an E3 ubiquitin ligase whose substrate is the estrogen receptor. Who knew? So we have a complex that is responsible first for repair of double-strand DNA breaks, and then this subset of the complex, the N-terminus of BRCA1 and the N-terminus of BARD1, are also responsible for regulating the processing of the estrogen receptor. That bit of remarkable biology resolves a puzzle that was very difficult for all of us to understand when the genes were first cloned. You can guess the puzzle. Genes were cloned that are responsible for a universal basic process in all of mammals, but only some cancers are at high risk as a result of mutations in those genes: breast, ovary, prostate, pancreas. Why? Because those cancers are regulated to a great degree, as in breast, and to a modest degree, as for pancreas and prostate, by steroid hormones. So these two functions must work together under normal circumstances to protect these vulnerable tissues from developing into invasive malignant clones. But if you lose the BRCA1 or BARD1 function, you lose both the capacity to repair and the capacity to regulate the estrogen receptor properly. This is just now being developed. If you look in the literature, I don't think you'll find what I just said. You can find the individual pieces of it, but we're just now putting it together. So, What are the clinical implications of mutations in these genes? There's been a lot of good work in this area in various parts of the world. This is one of my favorite studies. This study was carried out among women who were identified with a mutation in BRCA1 or BRCA2 in a population-based way, not because they were from high-risk families, not because they had many relatives with cancer. They were identified from a population. And then the family was traced by us, and everyone was genotyped, and the women who carried the mutation of the index case in the family we evaluated their history to find out what had happened to them. Often this was done from tissues for women who had died. And as you see, the risk of developing breast or ovarian cancer, whichever occurs first, is extremely high for BRCA1 mutation carriers and also for BRCA2 mutation carriers, although the ages at onset are a little bit older for BRCA2 mutation carriers. This result, when we published it about 10 years ago, was very controversial because some groups had seen only lower risks in population-based studies. It turns out that there is a logical explanation, and it is this. These are the same people, the same women, as the previous slide. But now, instead of stratifying by their gene, we stratify by when they were born. In this project, just by chance, the median birth year was 1958. So half the women on this slide were born before 1958, and half were born after. And look at the difference in risk, age by age. The risks are high for women born before 1958, but for women born after 1958, age by age, they are much, much higher. In part, but only in part, this reflects better diagnosis because women who know they have a family history are very careful. But one would gain 2 or 3 years by better diagnostic and scrutiny techniques. This difference is primarily due, I believe, to a change in the prevalence of the non-genetic risk factors for breast cancer. Those factors are the age at which a girl begins to menstruate, the age at puberty, and the age at which she has her first completed pregnancy. This population is Caucasian women in the West. In my population, that change has been happening over the last 100 years, so that 100 years ago, the average age at puberty for a girl in Western Europe or the US was about 16, and her average age at first pregnancy was about 21, so maybe 5 years interval. Now, the average age at puberty is about 11, and there are many girls who, because of education, have their first child when they are perhaps 30. So that interval is now 25, even 30 years. The length of that interval has been shown in epidemiologic studies all over the world to be the primary driver of breast cancer risk. Nothing to do with inherited genetics and BRCA1 or 2, but everything to do with the amount of estrogens that are bathing the breast ductal epithelial cells where breast cancer begins. In between puberty and first completed pregnancy, the hormonal milieu of the breast ductal epithelium is extraordinary. And the longer that interval, the greater the chance that any cells that have undergone mutation by chance will survive. Combine that with this extraordinarily high risk due to loss of capacity to repair DNA and no longer proper regulation of the estrogen receptor, it's not a surprise that the risks are so high. I say this in such detail because I think in Southeast Asia, you are now at the steep part of the increase in risk for these non-genetic reasons. With good diets of young girls, the ages at puberty are becoming younger. And of course, with the extraordinary education of girls, the ages at which girls choose to have their first child is becoming older. So this is likely to be the picture for you as well in the present generation. We're here, we've got this sorted out. Ask us. In the States, in our population generally, so Caucasians, Blacks, people of Asian ancestry, the proportion of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and prostate cancer that is inherited is as shown on these graphs. As you see, the same genes are involved for all of those cancers, but in somewhat different proportions. It will be the same here. The mutations, exactly like for congenital disorders, the mutations will be very different family to family, but the genes will be the same. In our American population, these are the increased risks that we see for breast cancer and ovarian cancer due to stop mutations or those devastating missense mutations in the genes. So huge increases, odds ratios above 20. One must take this seriously. I want to include here two papers that I have read recently about inherited breast and ovarian cancer here in Vietnam. My favorite paper is based on a cohort from Hanoi of 33 families, or 33 patients, each of whom is from a family with at least 2 cases of breast or ovarian cancer. Could be in the same patient, could be in 2 sisters, but both breast and ovarian cancer or 2 cases of breast cancer in the family. Those 33 patients were carefully sequenced, fully sequenced for BRCA1 and BRCA2. And as you see, a third of those families have a stop mutation in BRCA1 or BRCA2. This is exactly the proportion we see at home in families of mixed ancestry. There is also a paper from Saigon, from a commercial group, in which clients are apparently sequenced for various reasons, but I extracted from that paper the 79 patients who had themselves breast or ovarian cancer, but there was no indication of their family history. And of those 79 patients, 5 of them carried mutations in BRCA1 and by chance none in BRCA2. So that's also about what we see, a little lower, but about the same. So, thoughts about the Vietnamese story. Both of those papers correctly identified many different mutations in BRCA1 or BRCA2. Each mutation was individually very rare, just as we see at home. They were not all private, but they were all rare. This validates the importance of complete sequencing of all the critical genes. BRCA1, BRCA2, BARD1, PALB2, there's a whole host of them. You saw them on those pie charts. There are multiple mutations that have been seen only in Vietnamese families, as expected. Based on the Hanoi data, the increased risks due to mutation in BRCA1 or BRCA2 are very high. My understanding of the data from the Hanoi cohort is that by age 70, the odds ratio for breast cancer for BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation carriers is greater than 16, similar to what we have at home. And for ovarian cancer, for BRCA1 mutation carriers, the odds ratio is extraordinarily high. It's 40. And it's about 16 for BRCA2 mutation carriers. So clearly worthy of consideration. The next point bears on what I was saying a few minutes ago about what I expect will be an increase in breast cancer incidence here over the next short time. That is, the absolute risks of breast cancer among BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutation carriers are still quite low because the overall amount of breast cancer here is still fairly low. This will change, and it will change for non-genetic reasons. As rates of breast cancer increase among Vietnamese women generally, these high odds ratios will push the rates for mutation carriers even higher. And you will soon see that your pattern is very similar to what we see in women of European ancestry now. All of this argument about non-genetic factors and genetic factors interacting is much stronger for breast cancer than for ovarian cancer. The ovarian cancer risks, I think, will be somewhat more steady for you. They have been for us. I want to show you two slides that make the case for surgical intervention among mutation carriers. This first study was carried out only 10 years after BRCA1 and BRCA2 were cloned. The nature of this study, which was based at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, was that over the previous 40 years, women had come to Mayo Clinic because they were well, but they had severe family histories of breast cancer. Some of them chose to have bilateral prophylactic mastectomy, BPM, and others chose to have careful scrutiny, but no surgery. In that time, no one knew about BRCA1 or BRCA2. So they were making this choice solely on the basis of their family history. After BRCA1 and BRCA2 were cloned in the 1990s, pathologists and geneticists at Mayo Clinic went back to the biopsy specimens of these women, and they sequenced all the way through, Sanger sequencing, it was very slow, all the way through BRCA1 and BRCA2, so that now, years after the women had visited Mayo Clinic, they knew who carried mutations in those genes. So everyone on this slide has a stop or a bad missense mutations in BRCA1 or BRCA2 although she did not know it at the time. Okay, so is the design clear? It makes sense? Fantastic. Then the Mayo Clinic physicians followed the history of these women forward in time over 30 years. And you can see what happened. Everybody has a mutation, and the women who had chosen to undertake bilateral prophylactic mastectomy, only 2 of them out of all that set of women developed breast cancer. Among women who decided not to have bilateral prophylactic mastectomy, but who were followed, in the intervening 35 years, 80% of them developed breast cancer, just as we had predicted from the previous study, or we had observed in the previous study. I asked, because I'm obsessive, why did any women develop breast cancer if they had a bilateral prophylactic mastectomy? Why isn't this number 0? The reason is that early on in this process, some surgeons left in place the nipple when the surgery was carried out. And for 2 women, the cancer developed in those few cells where the breast ducts leave the nipple. Of course, that practice has now changed. This is a different kind of study, but also very interesting and important. This study is a study of women who chose to have, or not to have, removal of the ovaries and fallopian tubes when they learned that they had a mutation in BRCA1 or BRCA2. And this study is prospective. So when BRCA1 and BRCA2 were cloned in the 1994, 1995, women with ovarian cancer particularly, because it is so often fatal, were sequenced, and many of them learned that they carried a mutation. And of course, their sisters were told immediately, and their daughters were told immediately. And they knew exactly what the mutation was, so it was easy to determine if they also carried the mutation. Everyone on this slide learned that she carried a mutation. And as you see, some women chose to have removal of the ovaries and fallopian tubes, salpingo-oophorectomy, and some chose surveillance. Then they were followed forward in time for almost 7 years, and you can see the difference in the proportion of women in only 7 years who developed either ovarian cancer or breast cancer. So we learned 2 things from this study. First, that removal of the ovaries and fallopian tubes obviously protects against ovarian cancer and fallopian tube cancer. It also protects against breast cancer if it is carried out by about age 40. Because of the historical context of this study, that is, it began when the genes were cloned, many of the women who learned that they carried mutations were already 50 years old, 55 years old, 60 years old. So they did not have the protective effect against breast cancer that this surgery gives to women who have it when they are younger. There is now a great deal of work being done on how best to time, that is, at what age to carry out prophylactic removal of ovaries and fallopian tubes after a woman has completed her family. It is typically done at about age 40, a little younger for BRCA1 patients than for BRCA2 patients. It's a very active area of work. It works very, very well. And for those of you who work with cancer patients, I very strongly recommend that literature. It's moving very quickly. Treatment. When BRCA1 and BRCA2 were cloned and the recombination repair pathways were worked out, it became clear to molecular biologists who work on DNA repair that a very particular phenomenon was occurring in patients with these mutations. If a woman has ovarian cancer and has an inherited BRCA1 mutation and a somatic ovarian-specific BRCA1 mutation, she has no more functioning recombinational repair. It was recognized by some biochemists that because her repair pathway must be shifted from the optimum repair, recombinational repair, to an alternate repair pathway, if it was possible to destroy this pathway, then in her tumor, specifically in her tumor, she would have no capacity to repair DNA. Make sense? Right. So chemotherapy directed at the tumor should be extremely effective. Her cells that are not tumor should be okay because they still have one good copy of BRCA1. So various groups worked out this process named synthetic lethality. That is, they synthetically create lethality in the tumor. And they do that by inhibiting this alternate pathway with a drug called PARP inhibitors. This took a long time to work out, both the biochemistry and then understanding that this would work only for patients who had BRCA1 or BRCA2 or BARD1 mutations. This does not work on all patients because if the BRCA1 pathway is still functioning, it's irrelevant, right? So once this was all worked out, here's what we see. These are ovarian cancer patients who generally do not survive more than 2-3 years, but with good primary chemotherapy plus PARP inhibitor treatment, you can see that those who were randomized to PARP inhibitor in addition to their chemotherapy in the blue line have done extremely well compared to those who had good normal chemotherapy, but without that second synthetic lethality loss of the alternate pathway. At the moment that ends this slide, at 54 months, all the women who had been randomized to placebo were offered to go on to the PARP inhibitor. This is now standard of care, and it should be standard of care here as well. Probably is. So what have I said? I have said that it is important for prevention and for treatment to know who carries a mutation in BRCA1 and BRCA2. And this has been codified into policy by the Comprehensive Cancer Network in North America. And their statement is that women who carry a mutation in one of these genes should have an annual mammogram and breast MRI screening beginning at age 25, so very young. And that salpingo oophorectomy should be recommended to occur at about age 35 to 40 after completion of childbearing. Most women at that age, when they have salpingo oophorectomy, do use estrogens at a modest level, until they reach the age of natural menopause, so about 10 years. And that treatment for those who have developed cancer be chemotherapy plus PARP inhibitor therapy. So I have said that knowing that one carries a mutation in BRCA1 or BRCA2 or one of the sister genes is important for prevention, for treatment, and for families. How is this done? We are geneticists. How do we do this? The approaches to genetic testing that we use now are a gene panel, such as BRCA, a panel invented by my colleague Tom Walsh in 2010. It was the first gene panel after exomes. He's very proud of it, and he should be. It's cost efficient. The coverage is extremely high, very easy to interpret. The disadvantage is that the oligos must be specifically ordered for the panel, and that can take a little while. The second alternative process is, of course, whole exome sequencing. The panels are widely available. Of course, the process is very well known. The coverage is lower, inevitably, than for a panel that has only 20, 30 genes. And finally, of course, whole genome sequencing. The advantage is that no hybridization is necessary. It is not necessary to buy any oligos. But the bioinformatics, as I said earlier today, is much, much more time-consuming and expensive than for whole exome or BRCA sequencing. I made this slide because I thought it would be of particular interest to you. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of different mutations in these genes. In BRCA1, BRCA2, and PALB2 specifically, there are more than 25,000 different mutations that have been identified already. Notice, please, two things. For those that are stops, nonsense, frameshift, splice, 99% of them have a known consequence, and they are damaging. The 1% are some splice mutations whose consequence is not clear. However, for missense mutations, here, some have known consequence, as I have explained. Many are known to be benign, but many do not have their consequence yet known. They are gray. Sorting those out is a challenge for geneticists who enter this field. These are called typically VUS. In our practice, we do not report VUS. We only report mutations that we know are damaging. In our view, VUS confuses physicians, confuses patients, and leads to a great deal of difficulty. If, over time, a VUS is learned to be damaging, the patient is recontacted and the situation is explained. This happens pretty often. The field is moving quickly. Okay, this is a slide I did not know I had, but it says what I just said. That is, VUS is actually a legal term. It's not a medical term. It's a legal term introduced by the commercial sequencers so that they could not be held legally liable if they made a mistake. Because if you say you don't know the answer to something, you can't be held liable for getting it wrong because you said you did not know. The reality for those of us who must try to sort this out for our patients is that almost all of these VUS are missenses, and ClinVar, which many of you know, the website ClinVar, is a place where everyone, or almost everyone, puts their information about these missenses And gradually the information accumulates. And each physician or each genetic counselor does their best to interpret it cleanly and talks back and forth to each other, which brings me to this slide. Every time we evaluate mutations in breast, ovarian, prostate, pancreatic cancer patients, we get together with our friends by Zoom, here we go, and we discuss every mutation in every family. We also tell dumb jokes, but mostly we discuss the mutations very carefully so that what is returned to the physician and the family is our team, our collective decision about what we think is best. And we write out our thinking. We tell them everything we know, but we don't talk about VUSs. We say, here's what we think based on the profile that we see from your DNA. And we'll let you know if that changes. And this is an example of the way a typical sheet looks for a typical patient. So, what have I said? Here are the themes. Germline damaging mutations are individually very rare, but collectively quite common. In different populations, we see the same genes, but completely different mutations. Each patient has an inherited mutation in only one gene. That is, it's similar to congenital disorders. These are not polygenic traits. These are like Mendelian traits, not exactly because there are lots of phenocopies, but they're similar in that each patient has one inherited mutation plus, of course, a somatic mutation in the same gene. Cancer development requires loss of function of both alleles, usually inherited and somatic in the same gene, but somatic events, whether they are genetic or epigenetic, in the same gene, have the same effect as inherited mutations. If you lose function of the gene, you lose function of the gene. The critical genes, when mutant, lead to loss of DNA repair, and interpretation is much more effective when done by a team. And here's the team, and we all wish you the very best of luck, and we would be happy to help with interpretation as you introduce testing for inherited predisposition to cancer. Thank you.